Thank you. Congratulations on the vote. You guys are hardcore. 9-9. All right. Hi, everybody. I haven't had a chance to meet all of you. Hope to do so in the coming couple of days. I am Gavin Shatkin. I'm a professor at the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern, jointly appointed in the School of Architecture, over I'm an architect, Prof. And I'm the director of the Masters of Urban Planning and Policy program at Northeastern. So I've been doing some research and work in Jakarta. Well, this is the first time I'm back here in 4.5 years, so great to see old friends. But I was doing some work for a few years before that, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm a little bit embarrassed to be up here talking about Jakarta when I'm in the room with some of the most esteemed thinkers on this city, including Ayo and Kemal and Doreen earlier. But, you know, maybe my perspective is the outsider's perspective and the perspective of somebody who has come in with a fresh set of eyes and thought things through. Before I start on my comments, I just wanted to get a sense from all of you. I'm talking to the dialogue students. You've been to Bangkok, you've been to Jakarta. I'd love to hear some hot takes on the difference between these two cities, or the similarities. What strikes you about these two places?
Yeah, I can already tell a big difference in the pollution in Jakarta. We were walking to the mall, like we were looking over the river, and we saw like a bunch of trash, like someone scraping it. And like the pollution was bad in Bangkok, but still here it's just a whole other level that I haven't really seen before.
Yeah, I think the first thing I noticed was how spread out everything was. Like there's just highways that go through all of the different areas. And last night we were walking to a restaurant from the hotel that wasn't far at all, but it just didn't seem walkable. Like the sidewalks looked like they had never been walked on before. And the workers at the hotel seemed confused that we were leaving, like walking. And then also just driving, you can tell that like you just will randomly get off on a highway and you'll be on the highway for maybe a minute and then go back into the city, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. So that was the first thing that I noticed.
Anybody else?
I feel like, I mean, maybe it's just the part we've seen, we just got here, but the city seems like it has like a lot more integrated green space than Bangkok did. Bangkok felt much more industrial to me than the city does.
That's interesting. Hello, this thing is funky. Yeah, no, that's an interesting set of observations. Let's take one more. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my observation. So that is snippets. I mean, you've only been here for a very short time, so you really haven't had a kind of sense of the place. I get the impression from what you're saying that Jakarta seems both more planned and less planned than Bangkok. My own feeling is that Jakarta, you know, there are these big blocks. I mean, you know, where we're staying, the hotel, you feel like you're in Los Angeles. And it's this big block, and there's green space there are trees, and it's very beautifully laid out. But then you get out on the street, there aren't as many places to walk, sidewalks. It's not very pedestrian friendly. Bangkok feels much denser and much more walkable because there are people out on the street. But I would just say that I think you've just seen a very small sliver of Jakarta thus far, and I think I'm excited to get out there and see the rest of the city, because this city is a city of many different characters and many different facets. And so hopefully you'll get a chance to experience all that. I'm sure you will, especially when you start getting out to Puncak and elsewhere. But yeah, I'll get on and talk. I'll try to be as quick as I can, but you know, we had a couple of lectures this morning that talked more conceptually about kind of politics of climate change, and some really fascinating stuff about some of the kind of international structural factors and debates that are going on around who's responsible for climate change and how to address it. I want to bring that down to the level of Jakarta now, and I want to talk about, hopefully give you some thoughts, and I'm talking mostly of, you know, to the students who are on the dialogue, I think actually I'd love to hear from the students who are from Indonesia after I make my comments to see what your thoughts are. But, for those of you who are going to be going out and trying to figure out, what is this question of climate change and flooding in Jakarta specifically, hopefully give you a little bit of orientation. And so, what I'll be speaking to is, Arup mentioned that we held a workshop here about 7 years ago, and we had a bunch of faculty from Northeastern come. Arup came, we brought another dialogue group, we had people from architecture, art, myself from policy, and we got together a bunch of people from government, from non-governmental organizations, from community organizers, to talk about this question of flooding. And the idea was to try to get people thinking together about how to solve this incredibly complex issue. And so what I'll be talking about is my own impressions, and again, there are other experts in the room who might have different impressions on what came out of all of those discussions. And so essentially, the bottom line of it all is that I'm going to want to kind of ask all of you to think about and frame this question of flooding in Jakarta, which is an existential problem for the city, in an interdisciplinary and an intersystems way, but an interdisciplinary intersystem question in which questions of inequality and kind of social justice are at the very core of that question. And my field, urban planning, the way that I think of urban planning is that it really is, this is what urban planning brings. It brings an intersystems and interdisciplinary way of thinking about urban issues. And the fundamental challenges that our societies face, a lot of them are related to urbanization. Climate change is related to urbanization. Social inequality, racial inequality in the US context related to questions of urban change. And so what we bring is an interdisciplinary intersystems perspective with that core focus on social equity. And so the example that I like to give is if you compare, if you look at the question of transportation, and if you were to ask, well, at least many engineers, maybe not some of the engineers in this room, if you ask an engineer to kind of talk through how to solve a transportation problem, many engineers are likely to focus on the kind of efficiency principle. How do you move the largest number of people, the longest distance, the fastest, for the cheapest cost? And again, I'm not saying all urban engineers, Arup probably might want to correct me on this, and might have a different perspective. But that I think is what, the way that transportation engineering has been practiced for a long time in the United States. Planners ask a different set of questions. We ask, first of all, why are we trying to move people in the first place? Is it to get people to, the things that they want, to friends and family, to hospitals, to schools, to stores, and so on, to parks? Well, if that's the case, is there a way that we can think about moving those things closer to people instead of moving people to them? So thinking about accessibility instead of mobility. And that's a question of land use. How do we regulate land, and how do we incentivize development in certain areas to enable development to move people close to the things that they want? But we also ask about questions of environmental impacts, greenhouse gas emissions, climate impacts, other kinds of ecological impacts. We ask about social impacts. We look at different kinds of modes of transportation, cars, trains, bikes, pedestrian, walking, and asked, in what ways do these types of transportation tie people together and bring people into contact with each other and create a social life in cities as opposed to tearing them apart? And we also ask equity questions. We have a long history in my country, the United States, of building highways through neighborhoods and often tearing them apart and often targeting specifically low-income communities and communities of color because they're easier to push around in many instances. And therefore creating a huge amount of social and ecological damage. In fact, the building that I work in, Renaissance Park, shouldn't exist if it were for the plans of urban planners and transportation engineers in the 50s and 60s. They were going to build a big old highway that went right through where Ren Park and International Village are, straight through Roxbury, tear that whole neighborhood apart. But people in Roxbury especially got together, organized, and fought that, and stopped that highway from being built. So planners ask questions about, should we, instead of thinking about this efficiency principle, instead be working with communities, organizing them actually to fight, projects like that, and really working with people to try to figure out a better solution. Well, that's thinking through transportation. Similarly, if we think about the questions of climate change and flooding, I would say we need to think in this inter-systems, interdisciplinary way with this focus on questions of equity and justice. Because ultimately, the question of flooding relates to every way in which, basically, it's a question of every way in which human beings, in the way that they relate to the land, impact the relationship between the water and the land, which is pretty much everything we do. Every time we build a house, every time we build a highway or a train, or we cut down a tree, or we suck water out of the ground, we're impacting that relationship between land and water. And so the critical question with flooding is, who gets to make those decisions? Who gets to impact that relationship between land and water, and who doesn't? And when the water starts to rise, who is going to be forced to move versus who's going to have the power of the government to defend their right to stay in place? Who is going to be able to flee under circumstances where they're supported and where they're legitimized in fleeing versus having to stay in place and suffer the consequences? And so that's what I'm going to kind of talk through is, in the case of Jakarta, how does that politics of equity play out in the flood mitigation efforts? And the two images that I have, the three images that I have here, kind of really give a snapshot of some things that maybe you have some exposure to these things somewhat. I'll talk a little bit about them in my talk, but there are things to keep your eye on. I mean, these are questions that are present in Jakarta right now. And in many other Asian cities, people are being evicted for flood mitigation efforts, for example. The images here are of a community called Bukit Duri, two communities, Bukit Duri and Kampung Pulo, who were evicted in 2015 and 16 for a river widening effort. And so some people being pushed out, with the argument that they need to move in order for flood waters to be accommodated. But at the same time, when we were here 7 years ago and doing the workshop, the big government plan was this image that you see on the left. It's called the Great Garuda Project, to build a seawall and reclaim 1,250 hectares of land along that seawall and build an entire new town of 1.5 million people who were supposed to settle on that project. And this was obviously going to be a huge real estate deal. The lands were being filled. They were going to sell those off, auction those off to private developers. And so some people are actually being given huge land grants, wealthy, powerful corporations, while others are being displaced from their land. So there are equity questions, and these questions became somewhat heated during that workshop. People had some debates about that. I remember at one point, there was a Dutch consultant that was working on this Great Garuda project, and there was a journalist who, and this was a Dutch consultant, an Indonesian journalist, got up and essentially got in his face, really was debating him about the various terrible problems with this Great Garuda project. And so these are points of contention. These things are things that are actually headline news in Jakarta. These are very real and present issues in this city.
Gavin, if I can just interrupt for 1 minute. It's interesting for everybody here to know that if we were to ask you to point to one country that's the leader in sustainable development in these areas in climate, for example, climate-related sustainability, I'd probably point to the Netherlands.
Right.
And yet, this.
Well, but they're bringing an idea. So, the Netherlands, interestingly, is a country that's almost entirely polarized. Their entire land base is based on polarization and building of seawalls. Most of the countries, when you land in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, your entire airplane is actually below sea level. So they've been very successful there. The question is, can they do that here? And that's a really, really complex question. And I don't want to get into the details of that. Maybe that's something you can explore in the coming days. But a lot of people had a lot of very, very serious questions about that. So that project ultimately got scrapped. So what I wanted to talk about was, and by the way, if questions come up, if people want to kind of just interrupt me, please feel free to do so. But I wanted to give a quick overview of climate change, flooding, and politics of specifically questions of informality, because that question of the way that some people are being pushed out as the waters rise, while others are actually being granted new lands, is one that brings into the discussion the issue of informality. The fact that many governments don't fully recognize the land claims of large segments of their population. And so what is the nature of that issue? I then want to talk about the politics of flooding and break that out and try to really kind of account for that, looking at a politics of perviousness, of flow, of pipes, and of coastal defense, just to give us a bit of a framework for thinking this question through of flooding. I like to start with this graphic because it really powerfully tells one important part of the story of climate change and flooding, which is that the cat is to a certain extent out of the bag. You know, we heard a lot this morning about why we're really failing badly at mitigating climate change and slowing this process of climate change. But the fact is, even if we were to suddenly figure it out and successfully significantly reduce emissions, which is this gray line here, what this graphic is showing is if over the next 70 years or so we really cut back on carbon emissions and get close to carbon zero, well then the CO2 in the atmosphere is going to take another 100 to 300 years to stabilize because it stays up there for a long time. CO2 stays in the atmosphere for hundreds and thousands of years. So that's going to take a long time. And then if, you know, as that plays out, temperature stabilization will take a few centuries. This is because, you know, the water is warm faster than the air, and so there's an interaction and a modulation that happens between those two. So over a period of a few centuries, temperatures will stabilize. And then with regard to sea level rise, there are two causes of sea level rise related to climate change. One is thermal expansion, the fact that the waters expand as they get warmer, predominant cause of climate change related to sea level rise currently. That's going to take more than 1,000 years before it starts leveling off. And then due to ice melt, that's really going to exponentially increase over the next 1,000 years plus. And so again, even if we get it right, sea level rise is going to happen. Of course, it's critically important that we slow the process of global warming, but this is why this issue of mitigation is critical to begin to really think about. Then another graphic put out by that same Dutch consultant that got into a little bit of trouble at our workshop shows another aspect of this story, which is that dynamic of climate change related to sea level rise is actually interacting with other anthropogenic changes in cities to actually make the situation even worse. So this thin blue line you see here, that's climate change related to sea level rise. It's a very marginal proportion of the total sea level rise that Jakarta, and this is referring to Jakarta, that Jakarta is facing currently. This thick blue line that you see is related to modulations in high tide level that's related to the changing, the wobbling of the Earth on its axis in relation, between the location of different parts of the Earth and the Moon. So in other words, what's apparently an 18.6 year kind of modulation in the high tide level is a much greater effect currently than climate change related to sea level rise. But then the real big change is land subsidence. Jakarta is sinking. In parts of Jakarta, this is really referring to one particular place that's sinking particularly quickly. Some places centimeters per year. And so that's where the real change is happening. And so, again, climate change is important, sea level rise related to climate change is important, but there are other factors that are actually exacerbating all of it. So two things kind of come out of this. First of all, what this is really setting up, 2007, very important year when it comes to flooding in Jakarta, because there was a major flood that really put the scare in a lot of people and really got this question of climate change related to sea level rise and the potential inundation of Jakarta on everybody's map. So what this is saying is essentially between 2005 and 2025, the next period of that high peak tide, we're looking at some potential dramatic flooding at that moment, a year from now, right? And so on into the future, 2043, 2061, and so on. So we need to therefore have certain urgent deadlines to get certain things done is kind of the narrative that the government is putting out. But another thing that this really, I want to point out about this is that when we think of sea level rise, we sometimes may think that, if the water's rising gradually, maybe an inch every decade or so, we imagine ourselves standing on the shore and, now our feet are dry, and in 10 years our feet are it's going to be lapping up around our toes, and then in another 20 years it'll be around our ankles. But that's not really the way that climate change-related flooding plays out. The way it plays out is in these moments where you have peak tide, you have storm surge events, and you have dramatic incidences of intense coastal flooding. And so, it's not about a gradual, a very slow and gradual process. It's about increasing risk of very intense storm-related flood events. So another part of this question, again, the way in which flooding is interacting with other climate change is interacting with other anthropogenic changes to bring about this question of flooding, is land use change. There are actually three kinds of floodings that people who study these things talk about. There's coastal flooding, which is water coming from the coast. There's pluvial flooding, which is related to localized rainfall. And then there's fluvial flooding, which is the water falls upstream, snow melt upstream, rivers overtop their banks. Well, 2007, there were both coastal and fluvial floods, but the really bad ones were pluvial floods and fluvial floods. In other words, actually, it was really about the overtopping of the Chilliwack River. And so that has nothing to do really with, it has something to do with sea level rise, but it's not directly related to sea level rise. It's directly related to two things. First of all, climate change intensifies rainfall events. You have more intense rainfall events, but then also the spread of the Jakarta metropolitan region. So the red in these images is the built area of Jakarta. And you can see particularly an incredibly dramatic change from 1983 to 95 and continuing on to 2012. An explosion of this metropolitan region. That means more paved surface, more rain falling on more paved surface. Where's it going to go? That's what's really driving the flooding. And what's really interesting is you look at government planning documents from like the 1970s. They say very clearly that Jakarta should not spread to the south because this is mountain area, it is critical watershed area. The place that you're going on Monday, Puncak, is right here. It's a beautiful area, and therefore people want to build there. And it's mostly wealthy people who are building out there. But the combination of development of that area and intensified rainfall in that area is what really drove those 2007 floods and drives a lot of flooding to this day. So this is just from a government plan from a few years ago for the expansion of the metropolitan region of Jakarta. Bottom line is there are a lot of plans like this, and the idea is, government still wants to expand this metropolitan region. Still building high-speed rail lines, highways, commuter rail, new port. There was a proposed, we landed at Jakarta last night. There was a plan for a new airport. They didn't build that airport, but they actually built another one that's even further out of town. And these kind of building out these corridors. So again, we see this rapid expansion, and we really see it doubling down on it. And that's all driven by this kind of politics of growth that Dorian and Mario were talking about earlier today. That's continuing. It's a continuing agenda. And I would say that's what's driving flooding. And so, you then have this, you have these projections of potential existential crisis in Jakarta. This is one projection of what the flooding, the inundation of parts of the city would look like to 2100. Projections are that in the coming decades, some 40+% of the land area of Jakarta will be inundated. As 4+ million people. Although I actually wanted to note one thing. WINA gave us a number on about 11 or 12 million people living in Jakarta. But if you see this image, this is the Jakarta metropolitan region. This inner black kind of line is Jakarta proper. That's the 11 or 12 million people. The larger metropolitan region has about 29 or 30 million people. This is a city of about 30 million people. According to many estimates, it is the second most populated city in the world currently. So 30 million people. So 4 or 5 million people in Jakarta, but then within the broader metropolitan region. And these kind of images, I'm always suspicious of them because, as Bayo correctly noted, there's a lot of uncertainty. We have no idea how quickly the icebergs and the Antarctic ice and Arctic ice and the glacial ice is going to melt. You just don't know. But it looks like it's faster than we thought. So when the IPCC and other organizations come out with estimates of future flooding, they're often spitballing. I mean, they're usually they're giving conservative estimates because they don't want to be seen to be alarmist. So we really just don't know what the coming decades are going to look like. Very quickly, an image from a table from a study that looked at the 20 cities that are going to be most impacted by climate change in terms of increase in exposed population. According to this, and I don't believe it, I question their methodology, but it's a heavily cited paper. Jakarta is number 20 on this list, but I just want to note that these are almost all global south places, except for New York, Miami, and Tokyo. They're almost all in Asia, and they're almost all, with the exception of, I believe Lagos is on there, Abidjan as well. So these are the places that are going to be hit. And what I'm talking about in Jakarta today is present in a lot of other places as well. So now to bring in this question of informality. It's a very complex topic. I'm going to only be able to touch on it in a very cursory way today. But I did a project with a couple of PhD students a couple of years ago in which we basically mapped all of the areas in Jakarta that the government had in various ways characterized or categorized as irregular or slum or kampung. Kampung being the Indonesian term for kind of a village or a village-like setting. And this is the map that we came up with. And I just want to kind of juxtapose this image of flooding with this image of these places that, again, government considers in various ways, again, irregular or outside of government regulation or informal or illegal. And this really is the kampung and the irregular informal settlements is where a majority of the population of Jakarta lives. This is what most of the built form of Jakarta looks like. It's not what we've seen yet during our trip very much of, but you will in the coming days. And this question, again, of informality is very complex. In a very cursory way, I'll kind of touch on this, but I've been very influenced by an urban planning scholar named Ananya Roy at UCLA, who essentially says that we've often thought of this issue of informality as, well, these people over here are illegal, they've settled on the land illegally, and they're therefore squatters and don't have any legal claims to the land that they've occupied, whereas these people over here are legal. But what Roy says is, actually, if you look at it, informality is a state strategy that is used to achieve territorialized flexibility to alter land use, deploy eminent domain, and acquire resources. Governments use the idea of informality and they apply it sometimes very irregularly in order to achieve their goals. So a couple of things going on here. First of all, what we look at sometimes and see as irregular or informal or illegal, in fact, those places often do have legal claims. Whereas what we look at as legal and formal often doesn't have a legal claim. I have a doctoral student who's working with me right now who's looking at one of the most elite neighborhoods in Delhi, a place where people live in substantial mansions. But the thing about it is, the place is completely illegal. And so he's studying why is it that these rich people over here are building, government, actually knows that they're illegal, but they actually are able to get citizenship rights while the poor informal settlements do not. Again, a very complex question that was very cursory. But very quickly, if you look at this in the context of Jakarta, one of the things that I think characterizes Jakarta for me is this dichotomy between the kind of places that we're staying in, at our hotel, which looks very, high-rise and well-planned, and much of the rest of the city, which is, low-rise, these kampung communities, which are these very micro-scale residential communities where, again, most people live. The history of this is that Indonesia was a Dutch colony, and the Dutch passed a law, I won't go into much detail here, that essentially said, in the late 1800s, they said, all land in Indonesia is held under a freehold title, just like we have back in the United States, a freehold piece of paper that says this person is the legal owner of this piece of land. And of course, this being a colony, those titles were held by Europeans mostly, and by the Dutch predominantly. But there exist already tens of millions of people in Indonesia, and there are villages and towns and farms and shops and everything. So they recognize the second layer of claims, which they call customary claims. And so that's what this graphic shows is, on the bottom you have these title-based claims, and then above you have these customary claims. The customary claims have legal standing in the courts, and they're written into the law. Well, after independence, Indonesia basically reproduced this customary versus title-based claim system and this multi-layered system of land governance. And I've done some research on this with a local lawyer. What's happened over time is that those customary claims have been weakened in the courts and weakened in the bureaucracy, and that's been essentially used as a lever to advance communities. And I wrote a paper on this so you can kind of read in some of the detail in that paper if you want to explore that topic more. But therefore, you've got, again, land grants to wealthy corporations, and then the eviction of Bukit Duri and Kampung Pulo, which were a really signal moment in Jakarta this was hotly debated, and the residents of Bukit Duri and Kampung Pulo actually took the government to court and said, we actually have legal claims to this land. And they fought it out, and ultimately they were partially successful. And in fact, the government is being forced to provide them with resettlement money on the basis of that finding, that court case. So the point being here is that these things are, this is a political question. This question of, again, who gets to stay and who has to move is something that's being fought out in real time. And as the waters rise, I think this really is fundamentally going to shift the politics of a lot of different places around the world. Okay, I'm already going over what I hope to my allotted time will be. But let me very quickly, because I want to talk about some of the specific ways that this politics of informality and equity plays out related to specific places that you're going to likely interact with and see in the coming days. So the way that I like to think about this is to break out this politics of flooding as being four different kinds of politics. There's politics of perviousness, of flow and drainage, of pipes and aquifers, and of coastal defense. And each of these has to be considered in an interdisciplinary way, and in each of them, questions of informality arise. And what we're going to see is that in each of these types of politics, you kind of have a debate, and you kind of got a back and forth with the government, and certain interests kind of pose one argument about what's going on, but often laying the blame at the feet of low-income communities, informalized communities. But then those informalized communities speak right back, and they come up with an alternative. And I think you can actually see this as you go out and begin to tour some of the sites that you're looking at. So the first is the politics of perviousness, which is the politics, again, the question here is, as the rains fall, who has the right to impact the land in such a way that the water is no longer able to percolate down into the aquifer, but instead hits concrete and runs off, which is a major driver of flooding. And so this is actually a still from a very sophisticated model that was developed of the floods that hit Jakarta in 2007. They really wanted to understand what happened, where did the water come from, why did it end up overtopping the Ciliwung River, which this essentially is the watershed for the Ciliwung. This is one shot where you're going to be visiting on Monday, right? Up there in the mountains, a beautiful place. Why did the water end up running off and going down and flooding the city? And I showed that image of that community, those communities of Bukit Duri and Kampung Pulo along the Ciliwung River. They were evicted in a river widening effort, and they're sitting there saying, wait a second, we're not the ones who are building in the watershed that are causing that water to run off and come down in the first place. So yeah, and this is an interdisciplinary question that has to be thought about in an interdisciplinary way. This is a still from a map that was put out, I believe it was 2015, 2016, picked up online, the online map system, where they basically put online a map of the entire nation of Indonesia, showing property rights claims, status, and land values. And so I clipped a portion of this map from Puncak. Again, that area that you're going to be visiting, and the darker the green, the higher the land value. So what's going on here? It's hard to see, but you've got this little white line going through here. That's a stream. It's one of the streams that channels into the Ciliwung River, which is the river that flooded, right? And you've got a thicker yellow line, which is a road. So what happened? Well, the government built a road along this river, along the stream. Why did the government build this road along the stream? Pretty easy, because streams, water bodies are by their nature at grade, and therefore they're easier to build along. Well, once you build a road, then you have access. Once you have access, especially when you've got an amenity like a river, then land values go up. When land values go up, people want to build, and then they begin to petition the local government. And the local government sees that they can make money, and so the government issues permits. And so, in other words, the government is building roads and creating access and issuing permits to enable development in a critical watershed area. So the government itself, again, is complicit in this process of the development of the Ciliwung River. You go out there, you're going to see there are beautiful tourism complexes, there are villas. There's a lot of development going on up there. And again, I would argue that the government is complicit. Another aspect of this, again, arguing that there's kind of a debate going back and forth. Another thing that's going on up in Ciliwung is you're going to visit tea plantations. Well, a lot of the people who work on the tea plantations are fairly low income. They don't make much by way of wages. So they're actually pushing into the forest area, cutting down trees in some cases to plant for their own subsistence, an additional source of income. And so that is part of the problem of flooding, low-income people cutting into the forest. But there are NGOs and community organizations out there that are saying, hey, wait, we can actually solve this problem. We can find ways for these tea plantation workers to, I mean, obviously the obvious solution would be to pay them more so that they didn't have to do this. But since the people in question don't have much control over that, the idea is that they're going to create other kinds of economic activity, other types of agriculture that actually don't involve cutting down trees. So this is an NGO, and by the way, this is Alessandra and Kian at that time were faculty members at Northeastern who came as part of this workshop. They've since moved to other universities. But we're being given a tour of a shade coffee plantation where they're actually planting coffee that can grow in shade so that they don't have to cut down the trees, so again, they can develop another source of income. So again, they're saying, hey, you know, we recognize that this is a problem. We're trying to be a part of the solution. You know, whereas the people who are building the villas and the tourism complexes are not. And by the way, this is at least part of what I think Aaron Skiadi is going to talk to you about on Monday, because he's done research on this initiative. Second kind of politics is the politics of flow and drainage. And this is the question of who gets to impede on the water as it flows through the city. So there are 13 rivers that flow through Jakarta. The Ciliwung is a major one that tends to overtop and flood. This is an image from a plan that was put together back, I believe, in the early 2000s. It essentially shows the change in land use along this Ciliwung River, along its watershed. And you know, what essentially shows a series of images, like the image that I showed of the expansion of the Jakarta Metropolitan Region, that shows the way in which development has moved into this Ciliwung watershed. And again, part of what's going on here is low-income communities are in fact part of the issue. Kampung low-income communities are building on stilts over the rivers, impinging on the water, and arguably contributing somewhat to the flooding. But the fact is that the government is doing that too. The government is giving out permits and building infrastructure, giving out permits to develop condominiums and shopping centers along the rivers as well. And so both are complicit. And so the government's approach, when I was here and when we were doing the workshop, was to evict these Kampung communities. This is Bukit Duri and Kampung Pulo, these two communities before and after, you can see the way in which they were encroaching someone on the river, and afterwards they evicted people and they widened the river. Now, this arguably perhaps does decrease flooding in this immediate area in the immediate term, although there are critiques of this approach, in part that when you channelize water like this, when you widen rivers, when you concretize embankments, what you're doing is accelerating the movement of water downstream. So if there's a pinch point further downstream, that's actually going to exacerbate the flooding further downstream. So this isn't just a simple, easy fix. But what I want to really focus on a little bit is the community response. In the run-up before the evictions, the Bukit Duri and Kampung communities basically worked with pro bono architects and with community organizers and put together an alternative plan. And they said, hey, again, we can be a part of the solution to the problem as opposed to being seen simply as a problem. So we can redevelop our settlement, this is the same little nose of land over here, so that we're on stilts above the ground. We can green the ground to allow for the water to percolate down into the aquifer, while at the same time allowing us to live with the water as opposed to having to be evicted to flee it. They put together beautiful renderings where they actually did a lot of citizen science to try to figure out, like, what is the best kind of mix of vegetation along a riverbank to allow for the percolation of water to, again, solve some of this problem of water runoff. To create a built form that enables them to maintain their existing economic functions on site, to green the land underneath the building, and also create spaces for economic activity underneath that structure. So it was really a carefully thought out, responsive approach to say, again, instead of just going around evicting people, maybe we can work together to find solutions. The third politics is politics of pipes and aquifers. This is this question of land subsidence. And you can see this is a map of Jakarta that shows the areas of the most intense land subsidence. The red obviously is the most subsidence, really concentrated in the north of Jakarta. And this being the major driver of sea level rise in Jakarta in recent decades. This again is a question of politics that's related in part to informality. So this map on the right shows the piped water system of Jakarta. And what it shows is that the piped water system only reaches part of Jakarta, maybe 60% of Jakarta, 70% maybe. It's more like 50, 60. And it's really the quote-unquote formal master planned areas of the city that get piped water. Although the piped water is of poor quality, as told us yesterday. But if you compare this to a map of those kampung communities and informal communities, you can see that it is those communities that have not been given access to the piped water. So part of the story is poor communities really having not much of an alternative to drilling into the aquifer. But the reality actually is that the deeper you drill into the aquifer, the more land subsidence that causes. And so it's really not the kampung communities, the low-income communities, that are really driving this issue of land subsidence. There are a lot of office buildings, hotels, condominiums, shopping malls that are also drilling into the aquifer that are actually probably causing more land subsidence than kampung communities. They're drilling into the, Why are they doing that? Well, maybe it's partially because of what Lena said the other day, that in the bus this morning, or was it last night, that the water quality from the piped water is pretty poor. There's actually cross-contamination between sewage and piped water at some levels, so there's some people coliform in the piped water, and so people prefer the aquifer water because it is of better quality. So again, that's a political question, and we have to ask the equity, look at it from an equity angle. And then the final politics is that politics of coastal defense. And I could talk for an hour about this Great Garuda plan. But this was the big plan that the government was putting forth when we were here 10 years ago, 7 years ago. It's since been scrapped. It had all kinds of problems. I mean, one of them being that if the main drivers of flooding are pluvial and not coastal currently, then how effective will this be in alleviating that problem? You know, there are other questions. Most of the sewage in Jakarta flows through the rivers. They don't have a very strong, there's no strong sewage treatment system here. And so that's going to end up in this big pool that's created underneath the Garuda's wings. So what ecological public health impact is that going to have? Is it going to be disgusting? There were a lot of ideas about this, a lot of debate over the displacement of fisher communities along the coast. And there are a lot of questions as well about the land reclamation that was happening and who's going to benefit from that. In fact, there was a case in which a local official was jailed, arrested for bribery around the permitting of one of these islands. So again, something that was deeply contested and ended up being scrapped. So yeah, maybe I'll very quickly talk about how each of these is, again, intensely interdisciplinary. There cannot be one solution to flooding in Jakarta. There have to be a lot of different solutions, and those solutions have to be interdisciplinary and intersystem. We talk about land use conversion. How do we stop the development of upland areas? Well, that's a question that gets not only at hydrology, but also at law and regulation, at real estate, and politics. How do we stop this kind of political incentive for local government officials to enable real estate and constantly give out permits for development? Urban design and landscape architecture. Are there urban design and architecture-based ways of addressing the increase in impervious surface? Land economics, governance and politics, governance and public science. This is an intensely interdisciplinary question. Land substance, similarly, is about hydrology. It's a legal regulatory issue. It's actually against the law to drill into the aquifer, but people do it anyway, and so that's a regulatory question. It's a governance question, public administration question, in addition to being an engineering question. And then finally, the river rehabilitation, this idea of evicting communities and paving the waterways is a multifaceted issue as well. It's an economic, sociological, and anthropological question. How might we be able to work with communities and effectively engage them in a process of thinking about solutions that don't involve their displacement? Urban design, landscape architecture, again, community organized development, governance and politics, property rights. So we really need to think in a multifaceted way, again, about each one of these questions that flooding raises. I'll stop there and take questions, thoughts, comments.
Danish, if you could take the mic and pass it around. So let me start with a warm-up question.
Let me start with a warm-up question while everybody else thinks about that. And all the students here, I'd really like you to ask the questions, so please participate. One thing that we get asked, you mentioned about engineers, may have some other. One thing that we get asked all the time is, when we offer solutions is, okay, if all these things are important, what is the investment somebody somewhere needs to make? Because we have other things to do, right? Okay, we want to solve the flood problem in Jakarta, but we also want to build the education system, do this, do that, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think of all these solutions that are there, in terms of investments and return on investments, if you can call it that, let's say risk reduction of floods or investment. I mean, of course, I'm not asking you for numbers right now, but how would we even start to think of this question?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think ultimately, what I'm arguing is that there's a fundamental change in political mindset that has to happen to think holistically across all of these types of solutions. And so partially it's about changing the way that people in my field get trained and think about what we do. It's partially a self-critique of the way that urban planners have sometimes been complicit in both ecologically unsustainable and socially inequitable ways of thinking about development. So I think planners play a role, but I think, so in Jakarta itself, there have been political mobilizations. Recently had a governor, Anies Baswedan, who came to power in part through the assistance of low-income communities, who organized and mobilized to essentially force him or negotiate with him to sign a political contract to say, we are going to try to address community needs in X, Y, and Z ways. So it's a political, we need political mobilization, we need better training for planners, we probably need better training for engineers, so I'm less well versed in that question. And we need to rethink the economic model, and we begin to sound idealistic, but getting back to what Doreen and Yo were talking about earlier, we need to question some of the, not just economic growth kind of oriented ways of thinking, but also the kind of real estate oriented thing, the way that we thought about things. There's a whole history to be discussed, and Kemal was talking a little bit about this when he talked about the New Order regime and the way that that changed the politics of Jakarta. But Jakarta, many people would argue, is fun, and some of the most powerful people in Jakarta are real estate developers and the people who run the major corporations. What is the source of their power? And how do we clip their wings so that other perspectives on development might take precedence? And their needs are not always such a high priority. And now I feel like I'm speaking out of turn, and I'd love to hear what some of the Indonesians in the room and some of the experts on Jakarta would want to say. But that's my reading of a lot of the critique of development in Jakarta, my interpretation of it. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
I forgot to Colby.
Hi. Since the Garuda plan was scrapped, what has been done from a policy standpoint to, I guess, fix this or start to work on this issue, and what should be done from a policy standpoint?
Now I'm really going to feel like I'm speaking out of turn because this is my first time back in Indonesia since 2019. And so I don't have a huge amount of insight. Maybe others could say something, but they have been strengthening the seawalls, and that I think is absolutely a necessary first step. So that there was the idea of building this, that got scrapped, but there still is an existing seawall along much of the waterfront that does need to be bolstered and strengthened, and I think there's been some progress in that. Other things I would point to, there have been regulatory changes, for example, that mandate that any new development that happens has to have a zero runoff kind of plan. So in other words, they have to submit a landscape plan that indicates that they're not going to contribute to an increase in the existing runoff from that site. So they have to have swales and various landscape elements that actually capture the water and allow it to percolate and be out in front. I know that regulation exists. I don't know how strongly it's being implemented or how effective it is. Another thing that I would point to is, just the fact that community won that court case and had their land rights protected, and actually that plan for their alternative development, it's not going to look like this, but they are building a resettlement housing site for the people who were evicted in that community, right in that community, and they're building it, at least using some of these principles. So that kind of negotiation with community organizations and search for a negotiated solution. There's been incremental progress on that. I don't know, does anybody want to add to that? Anybody amongst the Indonesians who have more up-to-date and in-depth knowledge on that want to add to that? Kemal?
Kamal always has something.
Yeah. By the way, I wanted to note that Kemal did not give himself adequate credit. Kemal is a Husky. He was a Fulbright scholar at Northeastern for 4 months, so just consider him a part of the Husky family.
Yay!
Just the KHU war, it is up and down. There is changes in the government policy and politics, policy/politics. So then partially that already developed one particular island that you are going to visit, yeah. But not the whole seawall as the beginning of the design. But I give you a chance to meet one of the people that will work on the policy issues that the government publish more on our workshop. Then maybe you can get a better idea why it stopped, why change COVID, one of the reasons, change the government regulations and other things, change the politics of the central government and local government. This is more politics than infrastructure development per se. It's not a quite direct answer, but it's still like this. So we can see it's not stopped, but how it proceeds, we don't know yet. So the next cabinet, the next president will have different ideas how to proceed with this project. If they modify the debate or do something. So still kind of time and make life things happening.
History is not linear.
Yeah, so that's my.
By the way, I had one comment for all the students. I heard from some students who will remain unnamed that they are afraid to ask what they think are stupid questions. Remember, there are no stupid questions, only stupid answers. Please feel free to ask.
Which I have plenty of those.
Hello. Okay. So you mentioned in your speech that there's been a good bit of like illegal drilling into the aquifer and like illegal wells, and I know that some of that is caused by people like in these poor communities who don't have access to clean drinking water, and that's what's like resorted to some of the illegal drilling. And there's definitely no like easy solution to this problem, but I was wondering if you had any ideas of what could help mitigate this.
Yeah, these are big questions. I mean, I think people need water. Water is a human right. And so, the bottom line is this. I don't think that anybody can point an accusing finger at a community that is drilling into the aquifer for survival. You know, it is illegal, but I'm not very clear on this situation, but it seems like those regulations are very loosely applied. If those regulations are going to be applied, they should not be applied to come from communities. They should be applied to the large-scale developments that have the option of using the piped water system, but choose not to. No, I think another part of the question is, you know, fixing what clearly is a troubled piped water system, which is, again, it's a very resource-intensive and challenging, technically challenging thing to do. But I think it's necessary if the existential crisis that the city is facing is going to be resolved.
Yeah, I want to add on this issue. I forgot the name, but there is a PhD dissertation by Canadian woman, lady that's working on this water in Jakarta. I can get the name and her assistant, like one of mine, student as well. I hate to say this, yeah, I hate to say this, but this is the way I see. Water is human right. Water is business.
It's both.
That's to get the bottom line. And business is for everybody. So a cascade of business interests when thinking from the international water vendors loan and everything down to the international consultant partnering with the local consultant, engineers, contractors, down to the distributors, pipe suppliers, all of those things come together. It's quite complex, but this is the whole system of the water political economy. That makes things not widespread over answers. And then the very local, there are some people have their own in charge to hold the water key. If you don't pay this guy, you will get the water to be part of the neighborhood. So that is why this is kind of complex. But this is the way I approach and see the whole issue on the water, trash, waste, and those things.
Maybe Elon Musk can fix the problem.
That's so that's interesting that I during my work and during my visit to the US. Is it the same? What is the famous water consultant in the US? It's the same water consultant that worked for Portland Metro and they work for the city of Samarinda and Kalimantan.
Okay.
And I partner the Portland and Samarinda, and then somebody have a problem with water, the same consulting company, and I said, why don't you just fix your company working in Samarinda as the way you work in Portland? But my answer is a different atmosphere of working in business development in two different cities, even though technically it's the same consultant working for both cities. So it's not engineering problem, not engineering solutions, but more
Bottom line.
national and local politics as well. Is that much?
This might be kind of a silly question, but I know you're talking about how like the real estate market here is kind of dominant, and I guess I was wondering, like, is that made up of mostly like local people, or is that like a result of like colonization?
So it's the land. So the large real estate developers and the landowners are local people. But it's still, I think, a result of, in many ways, neo-colonialism. So, as I was listening to Doreen and Bayo talk earlier, I was thinking about, kind of like, what is it that connects this kind of global system of inequality and histories of colonialism and unequal power dynamics between rich and poor countries, and what we're talking about when we talk about real estate and flooding and so on. And to my mind, so partially it's about just legacies of colonialism and who gained access to land during the colonial era, but part of it is also about the Cold War. And I think you mentioned the Cold War, Bakibal, but the period from 1965 to 1975, this is stuff I'm doing research on now, is critically important to both of the cities that you visited, Bangkok and Jakarta, because this was a time when you saw the violent imposition of very regressive authoritarian regimes in both places. And who was behind the imposition of those regimes was partially the United States. The years from 1965 to 1975, those ring a bell. Those are the years of America's war in Vietnam. America was fighting a war. What it saw was a war against, or at least some people in the U.S. government saw as an existential war against communism. And they were looking to develop other models for maintaining political control in other contexts. And so they were actively supporting military, the emergence of military authoritarian governments, talking about the CIA and the State Department and things like that, in both Thailand and the Philippines and Indonesia. And so, Bakemal mentions this moment in 1965, 1966, when you saw essentially a massacre of any opposition in Indonesia that led to the emergence of Suharto as the president who was in power for 30 plus years. And the way that he ruled the country was in part by giving away contracts to major corporations and permits to land to cronies. And many of the same companies that got huge land grants in and around Jakarta are the same companies that have those land, control those lands or have permits to those lands today. And then some of them are the same companies that are getting the permits to those islands that are being reclaimed for the Great Garuda project. So, so there's a whole history there, and it's not an easy history to resolve. But that to me is part of what's going on here. And so it is both local corporations and, in a way, I would argue, a kind of a neo-colonial imposition. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. And it was a great question, actually.
Hi, this is more of a broad question. I'm sure you could draw several comparisons of Jakarta's issue of flooding with U.S. coastal cities. And just throughout your presentation, I was thinking a lot about Hurricane Katrina, which is obviously a big problem, and how that really affected the lower income communities. And I was wondering other major similarities you've drawn throughout your research with Boston specifically and the government's action in the U.S.
Yeah, so related to Katrina, I think you're absolutely right. Yo was talking about how the terminology of disaster is, thinking about disasters and natural disasters is faulty, or maybe it was Yo-Yo, our first speaker. And that was being discussed. I was thinking of something that a lot of urban geographers talk about, which is the idea that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Just that term is nonsensical, natural disaster. Disasters always happen when there are social conditions that put people in conditions of vulnerability, and then there's a natural event, or in some cases an event that is partially natural but partially is exacerbated by fracking or whatever, that then put those people at create risk. So that's what happened in Katrina. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was a flood that disproportionately impacted people who had structurally been put in a condition where they were low-lying land and they couldn't escape because they didn't have access to transit and because they were facing various forms of discrimination, lack of government attention to their needs, and therefore couldn't get out of harm's way in time, and therefore died in very large numbers. So, and this is the way that people who study disasters from what's called a political ecology framework, the way that they talk about it is, what are the conditions that put people in these conditions of marginality that then lead to them being potentially harmed. And that's very much, it's common across the world that low-income people live in flood-prone zones because they're flood-prone, because land prices are lower in areas where where there's danger. Hillsides are usually where rich people live, unless there are significant dangers of landslides, in which case, there have been numerous disasters in Latin American cities that have devastated low-income communities that have built along unstable hillsides. So, that to me is the common thread that connects all of these cases.
First, I was just hoping you could clarify with that picture behind you. I thought that you said, but I couldn't remember. Was that an idea proposed or worked on by people within the community that's living there?
Yeah, so you're going to be meeting people from Rujak, and one of them is Dian Tri Irawati. It's not a different Dian. But she, I think she was involved in this at some level. Yeah, so, yeah, so you can ask her about this, but essentially it was organizations like Rujak, which are really about advocating for communities and their perspective in questions of flooding, working with community, people in the community, having workshops, having discussions, hiring pro bono architects who come in and provide their services, coming up with this scheme. And it really is a rhetorical instrument to say to the government, hey, you know, you've got a plan, so work with us, don't work against us. Yeah. Did I ask the question?
Yeah, that's great. I was just, because I was going to ask, when specific communities are victims, I guess, of disasters like this, it's not necessarily their job to solve it, but it's important to like get their input. And so I was just, you already went over it, but I was looking to get more information on like what avenues they have to share their input and to be part of the solution, even though it shouldn't be necessarily expected of them to have the answers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the Jakarta government is not very good at engaging people in communities, but it's not alone in that. I mean, American municipal governments are not great at that either. But there's a strong network of community organizations, non-government organizations in Jakarta that are good at that and that have done a lot of good work. And it's really about advocacy. It's not just about getting input so you come up with a better plan. It's also about, again, these, you know, giving people tools to negotiate with.
Thank you.
I have a question about the political factor of these land subsidies. So what do you think about the political factor of this thing? Is going to be the bad side or the positive side? Like, do you know about the political contract?
The political contracts
Yeah.
that, like, Ciliwung Merdeka and the Urban Poor Consortium, those?
Yeah. Some kind of thing. So it's going to be always in the bad side of the political factor of this thing, or it's going to be the good side of going to be the solution of the land subsidies.
So I mean, those political contracts were not really framed around land subsidies, were they? I don't recall that was a part of that discussion.
It's more like some kind of this thing, like
yeah. I mean, I see that as a very positive development. One could argue that it's problematic that communities have to engage in that kind of coercive negotiation. I mean, what happened here was that the community got together and said, hey, we can deliver you a big voting block if you agree to the following principles of urban development moving forward: anti-eviction, resettlement, you know, working with communities and those kind of things. And so one could argue that the fact that communities had to engage in that kind of negotiation you know, was problematic in some ways politically, but ultimately I think it was an important kind of moment of dialogue where communities were able to, you know, kind of express their interest. What do you think?
It can be good and it can be bad too.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you join some kind of the candidate make the political contract with the community, it's gonna be good. But if the candidate add the political things to more like solution or well, I don't know about the bad decision that they make, it can be bad and it can be good for the if we add the political factor in things that we gonna look at the solution of the subsidence.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, another question is, lawyers have been consulted and they've argued that the political contracts are probably not enforceable. And so that's another problem. And I know that in the case of Bukit Duri and Kampung Pulo, there was a lot of back and forth where the government granted land, but then they took that land away, and then the government actually began to go over the community's heads and build its own housing solution, but then, that was stopped. And so it's, you're relying to a certain extent on the good faith of government to follow through on the political contract, which it doesn't always do.
I have a question regarding the water quality, water issue here, drinking water issue. Do you have any case study about any other country where they were facing the same issue challenge, especially the low-income communities where the drinking water they're supposed to pay for that? How the government of a particular country handled that situation, and what exactly the government of Jakarta is doing wrong and not taking care of the rights for people, especially the drinking water crisis.
I think I don't have very, very solid information on that specific question. I know that the various people have argued that with respect to the question of land subsidence, certain cities have solved that problem. Bangkok had a major land subsidence problem and stopped it. Tokyo, I think, at one stage had a very bad land subsidence problem and was able to resolve it. Exactly how they did that, I don't know. So yeah, I mean, and the question of water, and water access, one thing that comes to mind, it's not exactly related to what you're talking about, but for example, South Africa, according to the South African Constitution, water is a human right, and so the government is required to provide what they call free basic water to all people. And so there's a system in which a certain amount of water is free to everybody, and then above that, which most people blow, we all consumers blow past that free basic water, which is based on somebody's basic needs with respect to drinking, bathing, and other human functions. Beyond that, you have to pay. And so essentially there's a cross-subsidy. There's a cross-subsidy between the wealthy people who are over-consuming water and everybody else. So that's one thing that comes to mind, but I'm not an expert in water. You can dig really deep. I would suggest that you read the work of Karen Baker, who I think was Karen Baker is a very well-known scholar of water, who's done a lot of work on Jakarta, and the person you were thinking of might have been Michelle Cooey, who was a student of Karen Baker's, who's written really good stuff on Jakarta, but also internationally.